When I was 17, I was hanging out at a skate park with my friends one day. My big brother was into BMXing at the time, and so we'd hang around to flirt with his cute friends. Don't judge me. Everyone had a skater boy phase. So I'm at this skate park, and I was sitting perched up on a bench, tight jeans on, cute little top, hair flowing in the wind. I was feeling pretty good about the situation. But the skate park also happened to be next to our local mosque. And on this particular Friday, my dad had decided to stop by and say hello after prayers. You know what's up. And as he walked into the skate park and his head started to turn in my direction, by some miracle, I'd spotted him first. And I took 2 huge leaps, and I moved faster than I have ever moved to date. And I jumped off the bench and dove headfirst into the bush. And as I was lying in this bush and I was trembling, trying to catch my breath, praying to God that my dad hadn't seen me, because I didn't have my headscarf on. The headscarf that both my parents believed I wore, but more often than not, I would take off and hide in my bag the minute I got around the corner of my house. And I was lying in this bush, with twigs in my face and mud in my mouth, and it occurred to me at that moment that thousands of other girls and boys were in the exact same situation as me. Not necessarily hiding in a bush, because it's ridiculous behavior, but hiding something or some part of their lives from their parents and their Muslim communities. And as we grew, the things we hid changed. It went from hiding headscarves in your handbag to hiding boyfriends under the bed, to creeping out to go clubbing, or trying to creep in drunk without ever letting anyone know you were drunk. We hid miniskirts and revealing outfits in the back of our wardrobes and tattoos on parts of our bodies we hoped our parents would never see. Sometimes, we even hid our own religion as bombs started ricocheting around the world and Taliban and ISIS became synonymous with Islam and Muslim. And the hiding things isn't the problem. We all hide things, from parents and peers and colleagues. I've never met a single person who didn't hide something from their parents growing up. Admittedly, it might not have been a boyfriend under the bed, but they did hide things. The problem is why we feel compelled to hide these things in the first place. The problem is we've created a world full of types and binary individuals, and we expect everyone to exist solely within the narrow confines of that type. And if they don't have a place. They don't belong. And all any of us want is to belong. Now, types are all well and good when you want to discover what type of cake you like to eat or what type of exercise you like to do. But the minute we apply types to people, there's no room to breathe. It's the very same thing as shoving them in a dark, confined, narrow basement and expecting them to live out their days. It's not healthy, and it's not helpful. The world we live in today has given Muslims a type. The aggressive type, the fanatically religious type, the terrorist type, always a classic, the oppress their women type. And as damning and terrible as that seems, what's even worse is the types that we as Muslims have enforced on ourselves. The religious type, the good hijabi type, the rebellious type, the lost their religion type. We're adding to an already suffocating stereotype. We're shoving ourselves in that dark, narrow, confined basement. We're stunting our own growth. Because what happens when all those types begin to mix? What happens when the devout hijabi likes to go out and get drunk every weekend? Or when the non-veiled woman goes to the rave sober? What happens when the man who prays in the mosque every Friday goes out and sleeps with multiple women in a week? Or when a woman spends her day on the beach in a bikini and comes home in a burqa? What happens then? I can tell you from experience that the result is the biggest identity crisis you'll ever face in your life. That's what happens. Because living in these arbitrary binaries and these one-dimensional characters isn't good for the soul, by the way. And as I've been told many times, mainly by my therapist, is you can't exist in these extreme highs and these devastating lows. There has to be a middle ground. An alternative story, if you will. Now, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie speaks about this when she talks about the power of a single story. And she says, show a people as one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. Muslims have grown up with a foot in so many different worlds, yet they've only ever been fed one story from both the outside world and from within our own communities. And that's dangerous. Single stories are dangerous because no one is immune from them, and eventually you start believing in them. And because you believe in them and buy into them, you start doing stupid things. For example, many years ago, I fell in love with a white Yorkshire atheist boy. I mean, she also knows. She knows what's up. His reality and experiences couldn't have been more different from my own, and yet we fell madly and hopelessly in love with one another, and 3 years of a beautiful relationship ensued. Like a real gorgeous, trusting, never fought, did nothing but bloom with him type of relationship. The only cloud that hung over our happily ever after was that I was Muslim and he wasn't, which incidentally is a pretty big cloud. Somewhere in our consciousness permeated the idea that we could never be together. I'd never heard of Muslim women marrying non-Muslim men. I'd only ever known one story, to marry a Muslim, a story that was enforced by, well, everyone that I knew. The aunties at the local mosque would say, marry who you want, as long as he's Muslim. My parents would be like, bring home whoever you want, as long as he's Muslim. And so, in my desperate desire to meet the crushing expectations of the Muslim community and their single story, I broke my own heart and his by diving straight into the arms of a British Egyptian Muslim man I had met. He was just like me, both Egyptian, both British, both Muslim. And over an intense summer, we fell in love. And I began dreaming about our wedding. Both of our Muslim families coming together, and how finally the struggle between the two worlds was over. There was no more explaining why I had to go and pray, or explaining what my religion meant. And above all, there was no more hiding. Here was a boy that I could bring home to meet my parents. I was done. I was whole, entire. I was complete. Except, as we all know, any story in which a woman says she's complete on account of a man is never going to end well. And naturally, mine was no exception. As our relationship progressed over the years, it turned out he was exceptionally abusive, both physically and mentally. I remember him screaming at me one night that I was a whore because I'd been with a man before him, that he didn't know how he could let a woman like me be the mother of his children. And I, so desperate to fulfill this story and be with a Muslim man, I turned myself inside and out for him. I stopped talking to some of my male friends. I stopped talking to my best friend. I replaced the kisses at the end of text messages with a platonic smiley face instead. I drifted away from anything that might irritate him. I stayed up late at night sewing up the middle of my clothes because they showed too much cleavage. To this day, I have a real problem showing any cleavage at all because it has so long been associated with anger. It got worse, as these things do, and I still didn't leave him, still desperate to fulfill this single story, still trapped by the hold that it had on me. Eventually, he left me. He left me, and 4 months later, he was married. Married to a Muslim woman who wore a headscarf, fulfilling his own stereotype on what he thought Muslim men and women should be. And the problem with all of this is that the single story I had been fed became my reality, and it forced me to turn myself into someone I didn't like or recognize in an attempt to become what I thought I was supposed to be. And we have to stop doing that. Because we have to be able to look outside of those single stories. Because the truth is, Muslims are all over the globe, and they are, and always have been, multifaceted and layered and complex and contradictory. But now we have a new generation of Muslims who are refusing to work in those limited extremes. Which is not to say that we have a new generation of Muslims that are not religious. There's a big difference. When telling stories like my own, people often blame religion, forgetting centuries of cultural implications and traditions that have become tangled with theology. I'm often asked the question, are you religious? Mainly by men I'm on dates with as they try to gauge just how far their charm will get them that night. Or if I'm out in a revealing dress, bearing my flesh for the world to see, they'll say, you're not like religious, are you? As if religious is the very worst thing to be. Like I promise you there's worse afflictions. And I always give it a minute before responding, mainly to try and pray for some kind of patience. And I say, well, what do you mean? And then they say, well, you know, you don't pray or go to church or whatever your version is. Cue more praying for patience, divine intervention, whichever one comes first. And I tell them, well, actually, I do pray every night, and I go to mosque, and I fast once a year for a month, and yeah, I'm pretty religious. And then they tell me, well, you don't look like a Muslim. Again, more praying for patience, and even I realize the irony of praying for patience while someone is trying to determine just how religious you are. And I tell them, well, I used to wear a headscarf, because there was a period of time when I wasn't shoving it in my bag, and I loved wearing it, for 6 years actually. I tell them that my mum wears a headscarf, and she doesn't look anything like me in the way that she dresses, and we're both pretty religious. Honestly, I could write a book on all the things I've been asked over the years every time I present myself as Muslim. Everything from whether I knew Osama bin Laden to whether I know what ISIS are going to do next. Because naturally, I'm involved in their weekly strategy meetings. Or if I'm being forced to have an arranged marriage. And you might laugh and think, some people are so stupid. And you're right. Except this isn't some people, and they're not that stupid. They've merely been given access to one type of Muslim, and that's all they know. And we've all had a hand in constructing those types. We're all to blame. Because the narrative of a typically oppressed Muslim appeals to the educated elite in the Western world. It keeps us all in these manageable boxes, and that discourse in turn limits us in what we can do. On the other hand, the saint or sinner dichotomy is appealing to Muslims because it means you don't have to navigate modernity and God. Because actually figuring out how you take God on your journey in a modern world is hard. And so we've avoided it altogether and stayed in our own self-contained boxes. But the boxes have got to go. Because multiple stories do exist. And I know this, for I live them, and I live them with my peers. It's just we're not giving a voice to them. So I'm asking you to think again about what it means to be Muslim today. Because the truth is, we're all over the globe, and we're in hundreds and thousands of stories. We're the ones who partied every damn night, who got drunk and went to mosque hungover. We're the ones who went on pilgrimage and were drenched in worship. We're the ones who hopped from bed to bed and spoke to God about it the whole time. We're the ones who wore headscarves and veils and held on to our virginity until the wedding night. We're the ones who had abortions and babies out of wedlock. We're the Muslim girls who fell in love with girls and the Muslim boys who fell in love with boys. We're the ones who didn't understand ISIS either. We're the ones who prayed with our congregation and felt tears drip down our face as our souls soared on spiritual journeys we could never quite explain. We're all of them. And we won't be your saint, your sinner, or your scapegoat. We'll just be us. And we'll live in all of our stories, whether the world, the media, or the Muslim community like it or not. We'll be forever Muslim. And that will forever mean many, many different things. And actually, what a wonderful thing that is. Thank you very much.